Time Zero is one of the most unique episodes in all of BoJack Horseman, and it gives us some much-needed perspective on the life of Beatrice Horseman. Explored through her own dementia-riddled mind, this episode showcases all of the most important and affecting events of Beatrice's life, and pulls off the most effective twist in the entire series. But beyond making one of the series' most antagonistic characters somewhat empathetic, Time Zero is a heartbreaking look at the ways trauma can echo across generations. As I mentioned, this episode is explored through Beatrice's dementia, which is an incredibly creative framing device. The events of Beatrice's life occur out of order, and scenes often cut back and forth through time. One moment Beatrice is at her debutante ball, the next she's back at home getting ready. Sometimes the reality of the present with her son BoJack sneaks into these memories. Other times we're seeing Beatrice's battle with scarlet fever as a child. The important pieces of these memories come through clearly, while the less important details are sometimes not present at all. Nearly every non-important or background character is literally faceless. Some details are altered or changed based on our perception of those things at the time, like this opening sequence from Beatrice's childhood. The ladder to the slide that Beatrice climbs appears unbelievably tall, with dangerous crooks in the bars. This must have been how the ladder felt to Beatrice at this age, and so her reeling mind is adjusting her own memories to the reality of those emotions and fears. But while this is an incredibly interesting way to tell the story, it technically makes Beatrice an unreliable narrator. We can't be certain what she remembers is truly accurate, because her recollection cannot be fully trusted. And while I think they do seem to mostly tell an accurate story, the important thing about these moments, even if they are altered or exaggerated in Beatrice's mind, is that this is how she herself feels about these moments. This is how they've affected her, and it's how they've shaped Beatrice as a person and her worldview. So while we can't be 100% confident that these events necessarily played out exactly this way or not, we can be sure that Beatrice remembers them this way, and that can tell us a lot about Beatrice herself. Time Zero in so many ways is a sequel to Season 4's other masterpiece, The Old Sugarman Place, and in order to fully understand Beatrice's trajectory, it's important to look back at the events of that episode. The devastating events of Beatrice's childhood in the 1940s had long-lasting effects on her development and her relationships. In 1944, Beatrice had a complete and loving family. Though Joseph was always abusive and problematic, Beatrice's mother and Crackerjack both shared a special bond with her. They truly cared for each other. By the following summer, Beatrice had lost both of those relationships and was left with only her father. Crackerjack's death in World War II devastated Honey, who was later lobotomized in her grief. There are some obvious ways that these events changed the course of Beatrice's development.
Promise me you'll never love anyone as much as I loved Crackerjack.
But there are some less obvious as well. Understandably, these events completely changed her views of her father Joseph and her relationship with him. In her late teens, after Beatrice returned from college, we see how their relationship has become more antagonistic.
But instead of a bachelor, you returned home with a bachelor's degree and a mouthful of sass. What a waste.
While Beatrice humors many of her father's wishes, such as partaking in her own debutante ball, she clearly doesn't respect his views or lifestyle.
I'm only doing this for my father, who has very old-fashioned ideas about how a woman is to live her life.
The trauma of seeing her mother become a lifeless husk of a person clearly had a part in leading Beatrice to this attitude. She wasn't willing to accept her father's ways because she had already seen where that could lead, which is why somebody like Butterscotch Horseman ended up being so appealing to Beatrice.
Butterscotch Horseman, charmed, I'm sure.
This was a man who represented a lifestyle completely opposite Joseph's. He didn't live a lavish life. In fact, he had only snuck into her debutante ball for the free booze. He had big dreams of being a famous writer, and creativity clearly wasn't something Joseph Sugarman understood or valued.
Have your morning coffee or tea with Sugarman and Creamerman, but save some for these fellas.
Butterscotch was attractive to Beatrice as a person, yes, but he also appealed to Beatrice's desires to defy her father.
You want me to leave my own party with you?
Yeah, but I suppose Daddy wouldn't like that, would he?
Which led to the two spending the night together. Beatrice's disappearance from her debutante ball of course only angered Joseph further, who demanded that Beatrice give her well-to-do suitor Corbin Creamerman one more chance. This is an important event that changes Beatrice's perspective a bit more.
I got ideas too, and I feel I never get to be anything other than what he expects me to be.
Previously, Creamerman represented her father's lifestyle, and therefore Corbin would have felt like a surrogate of her own father to Beatrice. She falsely expected anyone Joseph wanted her to be with to be an extension of his own beliefs. But when she actually got to know Corbin a bit more, she realized that he experienced a lot of the same insecurities that she did, and this was attractive to Beatrice. Of course, at this point, it was just barely too late. After getting pregnant, Beatrice and Butterscotch elope with big dreams of success on the West Coast.
He wrote his great American novel.
While his wife took care of the baby.
But of course, nothing goes as planned. Butterscotch was ill-equipped to follow his writing dreams, and his failures slowly led Beatrice to fall back on some of the tendencies instilled in her by her father. She eventually shamed Butterscotch into taking a job at Sugarman West, giving them the more lavish lifestyle Beatrice was accustomed to. This led to Butterscotch resenting Beatrice, and he formed a relationship with their young maid, Henrietta, who eventually became pregnant with his child. We, of course, would later learn that this is Hollyhock. This leads to another heartbreaking event. After Butterscotch begs Beatrice to help him, she manipulates Henrietta into giving the baby up for adoption. This initially comes across as Beatrice's way of helping Butterscotch, but it ultimately ends up being portrayed as Beatrice feeling as though she's actually helping Henrietta.
Don't throw away your dreams for this child. Don't let that man poison your life the way he did mine.
Hey, here's an interesting side note. Have y'all ever noticed that Butterscotch, BoJack, and Hollyhock all have this same nervous tick? Pretty cool detail. Beatrice clearly blames her unhappiness in her life on Butterscotch and BoJack, and she truly believes that she's saving Henrietta from a lifetime of her own unhappiness. And this attitude can all be traced back to Beatrice's childhood. The final sequence of the flashback is beautifully haunting, and it all goes back to the moment that the last of Beatrice's innocence was taken from her. Obviously, the events surrounding Crackerjack's death and Honey's lobotomy played a major role, but following these events, Beatrice gets scarlet fever. In the old Sugarman place, we see three things bring Beatrice comfort: Crackerjack, Honey, and her horse baby doll. Two of these three things are taken from her in the events of that episode, and in this one, the final is burned in front of her. This is obviously a play on the old story of the Velveteen Rabbit, but in Beatrice's case, the lack of empathy from her father in an incredibly trying period of her life was truly traumatic. Later in life, when Beatrice is confronted with the idea of aborting BoJack, she flashes back to the shot of her burning baby doll and decides that she can't do it. Essentially, this childhood trauma is what led Beatrice into the life that she would later come to regret, and it's why this final sequence is so impressive. Each of the three events showcased on screen represent three different eras of Beatrice's life, and each event can be followed directly into the decision made in the subsequent event. Beatrice's baby doll is taken and burned in front of her. This trauma leads to Beatrice feeling the need to keep BoJack, which in turn leads to her overwhelming resentment of her life with her husband and son, and her forcing of Henrietta into rejecting the life that Beatrice herself had, thus giving Hollyhock up for adoption. And this is just one example of the many ways generational trauma trickled down from Joseph all the way to the characters we know and love in BoJack Horseman. Tracking this aforementioned generational trauma is honestly pretty depressing, but the ways these traumas can have lasting effects spanning decades is very important to explore. So let's take a look at this family tree of generational trauma caused by the Sugarman family. One thing we saw through Beatrice's childhood was an inordinate amount of importance placed on looks and weight. As a child, she wasn't allowed to eat pancakes or ice cream like her father or brother.
You can sprinkle some sugar on a lemon. That's a good healthy girl snack.
This was clearly a societal issue, but one that was echoed and reinforced by people like Joseph to his wife and daughter. It clearly affected Beatrice long into her life in many ways. When we see her in her late teens, she asks her maid for a pretty pill, likely a weight loss supplement. In her dementia-riddled recollection of the late 90s, bringing BoJack a painting that belonged to Joseph, we can see BoJack's fridge is full of sugar and lemons, which was the only treat she was allowed to eat as a child. This shows that these ideas were internalized so deeply that it permeated her mind even in her old age. But the way this trauma trickled down generationally actually was with Hollyhock. In season 4, when Beatrice and Hollyhock are living with BoJack, Beatrice spikes Hollyhock's coffee with Chub B Gone, another weight loss supplement, in addition to perpetually making mean comments about her weight throughout their time together.
You are so beautiful.
You could be thin too.
She not only psychologically attacked Hollyhock using similar tactics that were used against her for her entire childhood, but she quite literally drugged Hollyhock to the point of overdose, which were of course the events that led to this episode. Another theme of this ongoing trauma is motherhood. There are a lot of ways the trauma surrounding motherhood showed itself. The most obvious is Honey Sugarman's lobotomy and Joseph Sugarman's general treatment of that poor woman. One of the most haunting moments is when Joseph chastises Honey after Beatrice gets scarlet fever. Joseph tells Honey she is continually failing at keeping her children alive, which is horrible for many reasons, but it even implies that it was Honey's fault that Crackerjack died in the war, an insane accusation. It's also truly infuriating that he blames anything on Honey after he literally lobotomized her. But Joseph's actions decisions left Beatrice motherless for the vast majority of her childhood, and it also led to Honey giving Beatrice this horrifying piece of advice.
Promise me you'll never love anyone as much as I loved Crackerjack.
Which led to her general disdain for BoJack for his entire life, which led him to seek out that validation elsewhere, like in comedy and performing. But Beatrice also pushed that disdain for her own motherhood onto poor Henrietta, and in turn, Hollyhock. She cornered Henrietta into a situation where she was forced to give up her own child. Beatrice acted like she was doing this as a kindness, but it's clear that this was a manifestation of her own traumas continuing to affect her decision-making deep into her life. And while Hollyhock was ultimately raised by 8 great fathers, she still sought out her mother in her late teens, and based on the fact that Henrietta had also sought out Hollyhock, it was clear that she was never at peace with the arrangement that Beatrice forced her into. In addition to Beatrice's general disdain for BoJack, she instilled in him an unhealthy need to perform.
Nobody gives a damn what you feel.
You've got an audience out there, and they want to hear you sing.
This was passed down from Beatrice to BoJack, and then from BoJack to Sarah Lynn.
You don't stop dancing, and you don't stop smiling, and you give those people what they want.
The reaches of generational trauma extend even beyond family sometimes, to the other people we're close with. And sadly, we know how much Sarah Lynn internalized this. She didn't stop dancing despite her true desires to become an architect, and the unhealthy coping mechanisms that BoJack and Sarah Lynn both partook in ultimately ended her life. And while we can't blame everything BoJack ever did wrong on generational trauma, because ultimately BoJack is a person that made his own decisions, it's interesting to think about how BoJack may have treated people differently if he had been raised differently. Throughout the series, BoJack has a general disregard for the feelings of the people he cares about. The events of Escape from LA were absolutely traumatizing to both Charlotte and especially Penny, and we see that they have lasting effects on Penny's psyche even years later. We can't know for sure, but it's possible that this trauma could be passed down generationally from her as well.
I tried to throw it out, but I couldn't.
In the end, there is truth to the phrase repeated by Joseph and Beatrice. Time's arrow neither stands still nor reverses, it simply marches forward. Time doesn't stop for any of us, no matter what kind of trauma or adversity we face, no matter how much we might want to go back. Beatrice marched forward her entire life, enduring trauma after trauma, and then inflicting some of her own, and the only way that Time's arrow was halted was through her own dementia. And despite the justified anger that BoJack feels towards Beatrice as he leaves her at this nursing home, he decides to help her reverse Time's arrow one final time.
Can you taste the ice cream, Mom?
Oh, BoJack, it's so delicious.
This would be the last time we see Beatrice Horseman alive in the series. One of the most incredible things about her story is that it makes the audience understand and empathize with even the most detestable of characters. Her story is absolutely tragic. It doesn't justify her vitriolic and toxic attitude throughout the show, but it makes us understand it, and it also just makes the story even more tragic. But I think it represents a larger lesson that we can all appreciate, and one that the show really hammers home in its final few seasons. People are shaped by the events in their lives. The traumatic events in Beatrice's life were not her fault, but they shaped who she would become. While we can detest who and what she stands for, it's important to recognize the complexities and nuances of life itself, and Beatrice led one of the most complicated lives of all.
Why, I have half a mind.
You don't want to end up like your mother now, do you?
Better be worth all this.
Sing the lollipop song.
No matter how much it hurts, you don't stop dancing.
This is for your own good.
Please come back, I need to hold her. This close to falling off the deep end.
Go to bed, Penny.
Everybody loves you,
I don't
but nobody likes you.
like anything about
I want to be an architect.
You could be thin, too. It goes away,
Your
right?
sickness has infected everything.
The hard part is over.
I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.